Mary Margaret was trembling. They had found him. He was half conscious now, but he had been close to death then. He was submerged in the icy waters near the old toll bridge when they found him, and even through her panic there was something screaming in her to stay calm, to save him, to bring him back. She didn't know what had shocked her more, that desperate, urgent need inside her to keep him safe, or the moment when he had caught his breath and she knew he was going to live and pressed her lips to his in relief. She didn't know him. She had never seen him before in her life. To her knowledge, he was just a John Doe, a stranger, a nameless man who had just happened to stir from his coma when she read to him. And yet she wanted him to live much more than she should have. She couldn't understand why, but he had to survive. He had to live. He couldn't just die, not like that, not when she had found him. The doctors and nurses were clustered around the bed, and she stared through the glass. Emma was close behind her, Henry with her, and Mary Margaret couldn't face turning to look at them. Or she couldn't look away from the man in the ward. She wasn't sure which, and it was starting to scare her. "David?" Someone rushed past her through the doors and towards the bed. It was a woman, someone unfamiliar with long blonde hair and a tear-stained face. Dr. Whale tried to steer her away from the bed, but she kept pushing closer. "Who is that?" Mary Margaret heard herself say. "His wife." She spun around, startled at Regina's voice. The mayor was standing in the doorway, her hands folded before her, her expression calm, but there was an unpleasant gleam in her dark eyes. "His wife?" Regina nodded, walking towards them. "Yes, Mrs. Gold," she said. "His wife. As in husband and. I believe you're familiar with the concept, or are you so taken with Mr. Nolan that you had forgotten about the ring on your finger?" Mary Margaret felt sick to her stomach. "Cameron," she whispered. As heroic as saving a man's life was, that was no excuse for kissing him. She had no reason to be so relieved that a stranger lived, especially not when her own husband was no doubt at home, waiting for her to return. "I should go." "Yes, you really should," Regina murmured. "You have no place here, Mrs. Gold." Mary Margaret glanced back through the window. He was looking at her. John Doe, Mr. Nolan, whoever he was. He was looking at her, and he was so painfully familiar, and yet a complete stranger. She turned away, walking quickly past Regina, past Emma, past Henry. She knew she should say something, but her eyes were stinging and her throat felt painfully tight. She heard Emma growl out Regina's name, but she kept walking, quickening her pace. She didn't realize anyone was coming after her until Henry clattered up alongside her and caught her hand. "You found him," he said. "That means it's real." The tears she was fighting so hard broke free, and she scrubbed at her cheeks. "Henry, Mr. Nolan is married. I'm married." She took a steadying breath. "Even if it was all real, we aren't going to be true loves in Storybook." He looked so devastated that she touched his cheek gently. "Not everyone can get their happy endings, not in the real world." "But you're Snow White," he said, clutching her hand with both of his. "Snow White needs to be with Prince Charming." "Henry!" He spun around like a startled rabbit at his mother's voice. Regina was stalking towards them. Mary Margaret reluctantly released Henry's hand. "I have to get home," she said, forcing herself to meet Regina's eyes. "My husband will be waiting." The smile that crossed Regina's face was beatific. "I imagine so," she said, taking Henry's hand. "Come along, Henry." Mary Margaret was still standing there when Emma emerged, too. She looked furious, but paused when she saw the look on Mary Margaret's face. "Are you okay?" Mary Margaret managed to smile. "I think so," she said. "It's just been a tiring day." Emma nodded. "And she doesn't make things any easier," she said, looking darkly after Regina. She's right, though, Mary Margaret murmured. She smiled again, wearily. I should get back to Cameron. Emma looked at her with concern, but didn't stop her from walking away. The walk home helped to clear her head, and when she opened the front door, she called out a greeting. From the smell of it, Cameron was busy in the kitchen, and she shook her head with a small smile. He cooked rarely, simply because he claimed he was unskilled in the kitchen. His one dish of specialty was shepherd's pie, and she knew she could do with the comforting warmth of that kind of meal. She pushed the kitchen door open. The place was the usual disaster area it was after he cooked. He had no concept of cleaning as he went, and the sink and surrounding worktops were as cluttered as his shop. Cameron was sitting at the table, the whiskey bottle in front of him, a glass clasped between his hands. He looked haggard and tired, raising bloodshot eyes to her. You're back. I am. She hurried over to sit beside him. Are you all right? Did something happen? He waved one hand mildly. A visit from the mayor, he murmured. Nothing to be concerned about, dearie. He drained his glass, then set it down on the table. Isn't it remarkable how much her presence would drive you to drink? She took his glass and poured a measure of the whiskey. Amen, she said, then drank.